Sometimes the most powerful moments happen when someone's assumptions crumble in the face of undeniable truth. What started as a routine military inspection became a life-changing lesson about judgment, courage, and the hidden battles we all fight. The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Richardson as Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez limped toward the administration building. Her left leg dragged slightly behind her right, a subtle but noticeable impairment that had become part of her daily reality for the past 8 months. She clutched a manila folder containing her medical evaluation forms, knowing that today would determine whether her military career would continue or come to an abrupt end. Maria had served in the Army for 12 years, rising through the ranks with dedication and unwavering commitment. She had deployed twice to Afghanistan, once to Iraq, and had earned numerous commendations for her service. Her record was spotless, her leadership skills unquestioned, and her loyalty to her country absolute. But none of that seemed to matter now as she faced the possibility of medical discharge. The injury had occurred during her last deployment 8 months ago. An improvised explosive device had detonated near her convoy, and while her fellow soldiers had escaped with minor injuries, Maria had absorbed the brunt of the blast. Shrapnel had torn through her left thigh, severing muscles and damaging nerves in ways that would forever change how she moved through the world. The surgeries that followed were numerous and painful, but Maria had endured them all with the same stoic determination that had carried her through her military career. As she entered the building, Maria noticed the familiar sounds of military life buzzing around her. Phones rang incessantly, keyboards clicked as clerks processed paperwork, and the steady rhythm of boots on linoleum created a soundtrack she had grown to love over the years. This place had been her second home, these people her extended family, and the thought of leaving it all behind filled her with a deep sadness she tried hard to suppress. The receptionist, a young private named Thompson, looked up as Maria approached. His eyes immediately went to her slight limp, and she saw the mixture of curiosity and pity that had become all too familiar. People either stared too long or avoided looking at her altogether, and both reactions reminded her constantly of how much her life had changed. Staff Sergeant Gonzalez reporting for my medical evaluation review, Maria announced, handing over her identification card with the same crisp professionalism she had maintained throughout her career. Private Thompson checked his computer screen and nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Sergeant Major Harrison is waiting for you in Conference Room B. Just down the hall, third door on your right." Maria thanked him and made her way down the hallway, her footsteps echoing unevenly on the polished floor. Each step reminded her of the morning she woke up in the military hospital in Germany, surrounded by the beeping of machines and the sterile smell of antiseptic. The doctors had been honest about her prognosis from the beginning. Her leg would never be the same and her mobility would be permanently compromised. But Maria had refused to accept defeat. She had thrown herself into physical therapy with the same intensity she brought to everything else in her life. She learned to walk again, to run in a modified way, and to perform most of her duties despite the limitations her injury imposed. She had even returned to limited duty 6 months ago, determined to prove that she could still be an effective soldier. Outside Conference Room B, Maria paused to collect herself. She had faced enemy fire, navigated dangerous terrain, and made life-or-death decisions under pressure. But somehow this meeting felt more daunting than any combat situation she had encountered. Inside that room sat Sergeant Major William Harrison, a man whose reputation for being tough and uncompromising was legendary throughout the base. Harrison had served for over 25 years and had little patience for what he considered weakness or excuses. Maria had heard stories about soldiers who had tried to remain on duty with various injuries, only to be swiftly processed out by the sergeant major. His philosophy was simple. The Army needed soldiers who could perform at 100% capacity, and anyone who couldn't meet that standard was a liability to their unit and their fellow soldiers. Maria knocked on the door and heard Harrison's gruff voice call out for her to enter. She stepped into the room and immediately snapped to attention, despite the pain that shot through her injured leg. The conference room was sparse and functional, with a long table surrounded by metal chairs and fluorescent lights that cast everything in a harsh, unforgiving glow. Aaron Sergeant Major Harrison sat at the far end of the table, a thick file spread open in front of him. He was exactly as Maria had imagined, a large man with graying hair, deep-set eyes, and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent in service. His uniform was immaculate, his posture rigid, and his expression gave away nothing of what he might be thinking. "Staff Sergeant Gonzalez, take a seat," Harrison said without looking up from the papers in front of him. Maria moved to the chair across from him, trying not to let her limp be too obvious, though she suspected he had already noted it. For several minutes, Harrison continued reading through her file in silence. Maria sat at attention, her hands folded in her lap, waiting for him to speak. The silence stretched on, punctuated only by the occasional rustle of paper and the distant sounds of activity from the hallway outside. Finally, Harrison looked up and fixed Maria with a steady stare that seemed to see right through her. "Staff Sergeant, I've reviewed your medical reports, your performance evaluations, and your request to remain on active duty. I have to say, your record up until your injury was exemplary. 12 years of distinguished service, multiple deployments, commendations for valor. You've been a credit to the Army." Maria felt a flicker of hope at his words, but Harrison's expression remained neutral, giving her no indication of where this conversation was heading. "However," he continued, "the medical board has concerns about your current physical capabilities. According to their assessment, your mobility is significantly compromised, and you may not be able to perform essential military tasks to the standard required of someone in your position." Maria had expected this. She had prepared for it, rehearsed her response, and gathered evidence to support her case. "Sergeant Major, if I may, I've been on limited duty for the past 6 months and have successfully completed all assigned tasks. My performance reviews during this period have been satisfactory, and I believe I can continue to serve effectively despite my limitations." Harrison leaned back in his chair and studied her for a moment. "Staff Sergeant, I appreciate your dedication, but we need to be realistic here. The Army isn't a place for soldiers who can't keep up. In combat situations, your limitations could put your fellow soldiers at risk. We can't afford to have someone in the ranks who might slow down a mission or require special accommodations." The words stung, but Maria had expected them. She had heard variations of this speech from other officers, doctors, and even some fellow soldiers who meant well but couldn't understand her determination to stay. "Sergeant Major, I understand your concerns, but I've proven that I can adapt and overcome these challenges. I'm not asking for special treatment, just the opportunity to continue serving my country in whatever capacity I can." "Staff Sergeant, I've seen this before. Soldiers who get injured and can't accept that their time is up. They come in here with all sorts of reasons why they should be allowed to stay, making excuses for why they can't perform like they used to. But the bottom line is simple. If you can't do the job to the full standard, you shouldn't be wearing the uniform." Maria felt her temper flare at the word excuses, but she kept her voice steady and professional. "With all due respect, Sergeant Major, I'm not making excuses. I'm presenting facts about my current capabilities and my commitment to continue serving." Facts? Harrison's voice took on a skeptical tone. "Let me tell you what the facts are, Staff Sergeant. You have a permanent limp that affects your mobility. You can't run at the pace required for physical fitness tests. You would be unable to carry a full combat load over difficult terrain. These aren't opinions, they're documented medical realities." Maria had heard all of this before, but coming from Harrison, it felt like a judgment rather than an assessment. She could see in his eyes that he had already made his decision, and nothing she said was likely to change his mind. But she wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. "Sergeant Major, I've completed every task assigned to me since returning to duty. I've found ways to compensate for my limitations and maintain my effectiveness as a leader. My soldiers respect me and trust my judgment, injury or no injury." Harrison shuffled through some papers and pulled out what appeared to be a medical report. "According to this assessment, your injury occurred during a routine patrol when your unit came under attack. The report states that you were approximately 50 meters from the blast site when the IED detonated." "That's correct, Sergeant Major. And yet you sustained more severe injuries than soldiers who were closer to the blast," Harrison continued, his tone suggesting skepticism. "How do you explain that?" She had never been asked to explain the circumstances of her injury in quite this way, and she wasn't sure what Harrison was implying. "Sergeant Major, I'm not sure what you mean. The blast effects were unpredictable, and the terrain channeled the force in different directions." End of quote. Harrison leaned forward, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Staff Sergeant, I've read enough after-action reports to know that blast injuries follow certain patterns. The fact that you were injured more severely than soldiers closer to the explosion raises questions about what exactly happened out there. Maria felt a chill run through her as she began to understand what Harrison was suggesting. Sergeant Major, if you're implying that there's something questionable about how I was injured, I can assure you that everything in the official report is accurate. I'm not implying anything, Staff Sergeant. I'm simply noting that the circumstances seem unusual, and I have to wonder if there might be more to the story than what's in these reports. The accusation hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Maria could hardly believe what she was hearing. Not only was Harrison questioning her fitness for duty, but he was also casting doubt on the circumstances of her injury, implying that she might have somehow brought it upon herself or exaggerated her wounds. Sergeant Major, Maria said, her voice carefully controlled despite the anger building inside her, I was wounded in the line of duty while serving my country. Every detail of that incident has been thoroughly investigated and documented. I'm not sure what you're suggesting, but I find your questions inappropriate and insulting. Harrison's expression didn't change. Staff Sergeant, I've been in the Army for 25 years, and I've seen every kind of situation you can imagine. Sometimes soldiers get injured in ways that don't quite add up, and sometimes they use those injuries as a way to avoid difficult assignments or to gain sympathy. I'm not saying that's what happened in your case, but I have to consider all possibilities. The room fell silent as the full impact of Harrison's words sank in. Maria sat there, staring at this man who was essentially accusing her of being a fraud, of somehow orchestrating or exaggerating her injuries for personal gain. The accusation was so far from the truth that she almost didn't know how to respond. Sergeant Major, she finally said, her voice steady but cold. I have served this country with honor and distinction for 12 years. I have never shirked my duties, never avoided difficult assignments, and never asked for special treatment. The injury that has changed my life forever occurred while I was doing my job, protecting my soldiers and serving my mission. I will not sit here and listen to you question my integrity or my sacrifice. Harrison remained unmoved by her words. Staff Sergeant, I'm not questioning your past service, but I am questioning whether your current situation is exactly what it appears to be. And frankly, your defensive attitude is only reinforcing my concerns. Maria could feel the meeting spiraling out of control. What should have been a straightforward review of her medical status had turned into something much more sinister. She realized that Harrison had already made up his mind about her, and nothing she could say would change his opinion. But there was one thing she could show him, one piece of evidence that would silence his doubts forever. The thought of doing it filled her with dread, but she knew it was the only way to defend her honor and prove the reality of her sacrifice. Maria stared across the table at Sergeant Major Harrison, her mind racing as she processed the full weight of his accusations. For 12 years, she had built her identity around being a soldier, a leader, and a person of unquestionable integrity. Now, in this sterile conference room, a man who had never served alongside her was essentially calling her a liar and a fraud. The silence stretched between them, heavy with tension and unspoken challenges. Harrison seemed content to wait, his steely gaze fixed on Maria, as if he expected her to break down and confess to some imagined deception. But Maria had faced far worse adversaries than this bureaucrat, and she wasn't about to crumble under his unfair scrutiny. Sergeant Major, Maria said, her voice gaining strength with each word. I understand that you have a job to do, and I respect the position you hold. But I will not allow you to sit there and question my character based on nothing more than your own suspicions and prejudices. Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly, the first change in his expression since the meeting began. Prejudices? Staff Sergeant, I think you're overreacting. I'm simply doing my due diligence in reviewing your case. Due diligence? Maria's voice took on an edge that she usually reserved for dealing with insubordinate soldiers. You've essentially accused me of faking my injuries or somehow bringing them upon myself for personal gain. That's not due diligence, Sergeant Major. That's character assassination.
Harrison leaned back in his chair, seemingly unfazed by Maria's growing anger. Staff Sergeant, if you can't handle having your story questioned, then maybe you're not as ready to remain in the Army as you think you are. Military life requires thick skin and the ability to deal with difficult situations. The patronizing tone in his voice was the final straw for Maria. She had endured months of pain, rehabilitation, and uncertainty about her future. She had fought to regain her mobility, struggled to adapt to her limitations, and worked tirelessly to prove her continued value as a soldier. But she would not sit there and be lectured about military life by a man who was questioning the very sacrifice that had earned her the right to wear the uniform. "Sergeant Major," Maria said, standing up despite the sharp pain that shot through her injured leg. "You want to question my story? You want to suggest that my injuries aren't what they seem? Fine. But I'm going to show you exactly what happened to me that day, and then I never want to hear another word about my integrity or my commitment to this army." Harrison looked up at her with mild interest, as if he were watching a mildly entertaining television program. "Staff Sergeant, I don't think dramatic gestures are going to help your case here." "This isn't a dramatic gesture," Maria replied, her hands moving to her belt buckle. "This is the truth, the whole truth." Something you seem to have a problem recognizing. For the first time since the meeting began, Harrison's expression showed a hint of uncertainty. "Staff Sergeant, what exactly are you doing?" Maria unbuckled her belt and began to unbutton her uniform pants. "I'm going to show you my excuse, Sergeant Major. I'm going to show you exactly what that IED did to me, and then you can decide for yourself whether I'm the kind of soldier who makes things up for sympathy." Harrison's face reddened slightly, and he held up a hand. "Staff Sergeant, this is inappropriate. You need to stop what you're doing right now." But Maria was beyond caring about appropriateness or protocol. She had reached her breaking point, and the only way forward was through the uncomfortable truth of what she had endured. "What's inappropriate, Sergeant Major, is you sitting there questioning my sacrifice while you've never spent a day in combat. What's inappropriate is you suggesting that I somehow brought this upon myself." She pushed her pants down to her knees, revealing her left leg from mid-thigh to below the knee. What Harrison saw made him fall silent immediately. The leg was a road map of surgical scars, each one telling a story of trauma and reconstruction. The main scar ran from just above her knee to mid-thigh, a thick raised line of scar tissue that showed where surgeons had worked to repair the damage caused by flying metal. But it wasn't just the scars that made Harrison's expression change. It was the clear evidence of muscle loss, the way her left thigh was noticeably smaller than her right. The visible indentations where muscle tissue had been too damaged to save. The skin itself was discolored in places, showing the telltale signs of severe trauma and extensive grafting procedures. This is what 50 meters from an IED looks like when you're unlucky enough to be standing in the wrong place, Maria said, her voice steady despite the vulnerability of her position. "The shrapnel tore through my quadriceps, severed my vastus lateralis muscle, and damaged nerves that control feeling and movement in my leg." Ooh. She pointed to a particularly prominent scar that curved around the side of her thigh. "This is where they had to go in 3 separate times to remove metal fragments that kept working their way to the surface. Each surgery meant weeks of recovery and starting physical therapy all over again." Harrison stared at her leg in silence, his face pale and his earlier confidence completely evaporated. Maria could see the exact moment when the reality of her injuries hit him, when he understood that no one could fake the kind of damage he was looking at. "The blast threw me into a concrete barrier," Maria continued, pointing to another set of scars on her knee. "The impact shattered my kneecap, which is why I have these surgical screws holding it together. Do you know what it feels like to learn to walk again, Sergeant Major? Do you know what it's like to wake up every morning wondering if today is the day your leg is going to give out completely?" She pulled her pants back up and rebuckled her belt, her movements sharp and angry. "The reason I was injured worse than soldiers closer to the blast is because I was standing next to a concrete wall when the IED went off. The blast wave bounced off the wall and amplified the force that hit me. It's all in the engineering report that was filed with the incident investigation if you had bothered to read it thoroughly." Harrison remained silent, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. Maria could see that her revelation had shaken him, but she wasn't done. The anger and frustration of months of doubt and questioning poured out of her. "You want to know why I'm fighting so hard to stay in the army?" she asked, settling back into her chair. "It's not because I can't accept that my time is up. It's because this uniform, this service, this mission is all I have left. That blast didn't just take part of my leg, Sergeant Major. It took my confidence, my sense of invincibility, and my belief that the world is a fair place. But what it didn't take was my ability to lead, my knowledge, or my dedication to the soldiers under my command. She leaned forward, fixing Harrison with the same intense stare he had been giving her. I've spent the last 8 months learning to do things differently, not learning to make excuses. I found ways to compensate for my physical limitations because I refused to let this injury define me or limit my service. But apparently, that's not good enough for you. The room fell silent again. But this time the silence felt different. The aggressive tension that had filled the space was replaced by something heavier and more uncomfortable. Harrison finally looked up from the table, and Maria could see something in his expression that hadn't been there before. Shame. "Staff Sergeant," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." "Yes, you do," Maria replied without hesitation. Harrison cleared his throat and straightened in his chair, seeming to gather himself. "I made assumptions about your situation based on incomplete information and my own preconceptions. That was unprofessional and unfair to you." "It was more than unprofessional," Maria said. "It was cruel. Do you have any idea how many times I've had to justify my injuries to people who think they know better? Do you know how exhausting it is to constantly prove that your pain is real, your limitations are genuine, and your service record speaks for itself?" Harrison nodded slowly. "I can only imagine, and I'm truly sorry for adding to that burden." Maria studied his face, looking for signs of sincerity. She had learned to read people well during her years in the military, and she could see that his apology was genuine, even if it had come too late to undo the damage of his earlier words. "Sergeant Major, I don't want your pity," she said. "I want your respect. I want you to evaluate my request to remain on duty based on my actual performance and capabilities, not on your assumptions about what disabled soldiers can or cannot do." "You're right," Harrison said, "and you have my respect. What you showed me today took tremendous courage, and it opened my eyes to my own biases." Maria felt some of her anger beginning to subside, replaced by exhaustion and a deep sadness about the entire situation. "I didn't want to have to show you my scars to prove my worth as a soldier, but you left me no choice." Harrison picked up her file and began reviewing it again, but this time his expression was different. He seemed to be actually reading and considering the information, rather than looking for reasons to dismiss her. "Staff Sergeant, looking at your performance reviews from the past 6 months, I see that your supervisors have rated you as meeting or exceeding expectations in all areas of evaluation. Your soldiers speak highly of your leadership, and there are no documented incidents of your physical limitations affecting mission performance." Maria nodded. "That's because I've worked incredibly hard to make sure my injury doesn't impact my ability to do my job. I've adapted, I've learned new techniques, and I've proven that I can still be effective." Harrison continued reading. "I also see here that you've been attending advanced leadership courses and have completed additional training in logistics management. It appears you've been preparing for roles that would allow you to contribute in ways that don't rely solely on physical capabilities." "Exactly," Maria said. "I'm not trying to pretend that I can do everything I used to do, but there are many ways to serve, and I believe I still have value to offer the Army." Harrison closed the file and looked at her directly. "Staff Sergeant, based on what I've seen today and what's documented in your record, I'm going to recommend that your request to remain on active duty be approved. However, I want to be clear that this recommendation comes with the understanding that your role may need to be adjusted to accommodate your limitations." Maria felt a wave of relief wash over her, followed immediately by a sense of vindication. "I understand, Sergeant Major, and I'm prepared to accept whatever role allows me to continue serving." "There's one more thing," Harrison said, his voice taking on a more personal tone. "I want you to know that what happened here today has been a learning experience for me. I've been in the Army for a long time, and I've developed certain attitudes and assumptions that aren't always fair or accurate. Your courage in confronting those assumptions has made me realize that I need to examine my own biases more carefully." Maria appreciated his honesty, but she also knew that the damage had already been done. The doubt he had cast on her character and integrity couldn't be completely erased by an apology, no matter how sincere. "Sergeant Major, I hope that other soldiers in my situation won't have to go through what I went through today," she said. We've all sacrificed for our country in different ways, and we deserve to be judged on our merits, not on assumptions about our limitations. Harrison nodded solemnly. You're absolutely right, and I give you my word that I'll be more mindful of these issues in the future. As the meeting concluded, Maria felt a complex mixture of emotions. She had won the battle to remain on active duty, but the victory felt hollow after the humiliation she had endured. She had been forced to expose her most vulnerable physical self to prove her worth as a soldier, and that violation of her dignity would stay with her for a long time. Walking out of that conference room, Maria realized that her fight wasn't over. She had convinced one skeptical sergeant major, but there would be others who questioned her abilities and her commitment. The battle scars on her leg were visible proof of her sacrifice, but the emotional scars from encounters like this, one would be much harder to heal. Still, she had prevailed, and that knowledge gave her strength. She had faced down doubt and prejudice with truth and courage, and she had emerged with her honor intact and her future secured. It wasn't the victory she had hoped for, but it was the victory she had earned. 3 months had passed since that uncomfortable confrontation in Conference Room B, and Maria's life had taken on a new rhythm. True to his word, Sergeant Major Harrison had recommended her for continued active duty, and she had been reassigned to a position in training and development that allowed her to use her combat experience and leadership skills while accommodating her physical limitations. The new role had proven to be more fulfilling than Maria had anticipated. She was responsible for developing training programs for soldiers preparing for deployment, and her first-hand knowledge of combat conditions made her insights invaluable. The young soldiers she worked with respected her experience and looked up to her as someone who had been there and done that. Her injury, rather than being a source of shame or limitation, had become a symbol of her credibility and commitment. But the real change hadn't been in Maria's professional life. It had been in how the entire base had begun to view wounded warriors and soldiers with disabilities. Harrison had kept his promise about examining his own biases, and the transformation in his approach had rippled throughout the command structure. It started with small changes. Harrison began requiring all supervisors to attend sensitivity training focused on working with injured and disabled service members. He instituted new protocols for medical review boards, ensuring that decisions were based solely on documented capabilities, rather than assumptions about limitations. Most importantly, he had begun actively seeking out opportunities to highlight the contributions of soldiers who had overcome significant challenges. Maria first noticed the change during a base-wide meeting where Harrison was addressing new policies and procedures. Instead of his usual stern demeanor, she saw something different in his presentation. When he discussed the new protocols for evaluating injured soldiers, his voice carried a weight of personal conviction that hadn't been there before. We have learned some valuable lessons recently about the importance of judging our soldiers based on their actual performance, rather than our preconceptions, he had said, his eyes briefly meeting Maria's across the crowded auditorium. Every soldier who has served in combat carries scars, some visible and some not. Our job is to help them continue to contribute, in whatever way they can, not to push them aside based on outdated assumptions. The impact of this shift in leadership philosophy became evident in the weeks that followed. Other wounded soldiers began coming forward, sharing their own experiences and requesting opportunities to remain on active duty in modified roles. The base medical board, which had previously been seen as a one-way ticket to discharge, began working more collaboratively with injured personnel to find creative solutions that benefited both the individual soldiers and the Army as a whole. Maria found herself becoming an unofficial advocate and mentor for these soldiers. Her experience with Harrison had given her a unique perspective on how to navigate the system and fight for fair treatment. She had also learned valuable lessons about the power of vulnerability and the importance of standing up for herself when faced with injustice. One afternoon, Maria was working in her office when she received a call from Private Thompson, the receptionist who had checked her in for that fateful meeting with Harrison. His voice sounded nervous as he explained that there was a soldier in the waiting area who specifically wanted to speak with her. She says her name is Specialist Jennifer Walsh, and she heard about how you handled your medical review. She's been waiting for over an hour and says she won't leave until she can talk to you. Maria was intrigued and told Thompson to send Specialist Walsh to her office. A few minutes later, there was a soft knock on her door and a young woman in uniform entered. Maria could immediately see that Walsh was struggling with some kind of physical challenge. though it wasn't immediately obvious what it was. "Ma'am, thank you for seeing me," Walsh said, standing at attention despite what appeared to be some difficulty maintaining her balance. "At ease, specialist. Please, have a seat and tell me what's on your mind." Walsh settled carefully into the chair across from Maria's desk, and as she did, Maria noticed that her hands trembled slightly. "Ma'am, I heard about what happened in your medical review with Sergeant Major Harrison. How you had to show him your injuries to prove they were real." Maria felt a familiar tightness in her chest. She had hoped that the details of that meeting would remain private, but in the close-knit environment of a military base, word had inevitably spread. "Specialist, I'm not sure what you've heard, but—" "Ma'am, I have Parkinson's disease," Walsh interrupted, her voice quiet but determined. "Early onset. I was diagnosed 6 months ago, and I've been trying to hide it ever since." The revelation hit Maria like a physical blow. Parkinson's disease in someone so young was not only devastating personally, but it also presented unique challenges in a military context. The tremors, balance problems, and other symptoms would make many traditional military duties impossible. "I'm so sorry, Specialist. That must be incredibly difficult for you." Walsh nodded, her eyes filling with tears she was clearly trying to hold back. "The thing is, ma'am, I'm good at my job. I work in communications, and I can still do everything required of me. But I know that if I report my condition officially, they'll process me out immediately. No questions asked, no consideration of what I can still contribute." Maria understood the impossible position Walsh found herself in. Military regulations regarding medical conditions were strict and often inflexible, designed more to protect the institution than to accommodate individual circumstances. "What is it you're hoping I can help you with?" Maria asked gently. "I want to know how you found the courage to fight for yourself. How did you know it was worth it to risk everything to stay in the Army? Because right now, I feel like I'm living a lie every day, pretending to be fine when I'm not, but I'm terrified that telling the truth will cost me everything I've worked for." Maria leaned back in her chair, considering her words carefully. The situation Walsh described was different from her own, but the core dilemma was the same. How do you maintain your integrity while fighting a system that seems determined to push you aside? Specialist, the first thing you need to understand is that hiding your condition isn't sustainable. It's not fair to you, and it's not fair to your fellow soldiers who might need to depend on you in certain situations. Walsh's face fell, and Maria could see that this wasn't the answer she had been hoping for. "But," Maria continued, "that doesn't mean you have to accept defeat. What I learned from my experience is that you have to be your own advocate. You have to be prepared to fight for yourself, and you have to be willing to educate people who don't understand your situation." She told Walsh about her confrontation with Harrison, including the difficult decision to reveal her scars. She explained how that moment of vulnerability had ultimately led to not just her own success, but to broader changes in how the base handled similar cases. "The key," Maria said, "is to approach the situation from a position of strength, not weakness. Don't focus on what you can't do. Focus on what you can do, and be prepared with concrete examples of how you can continue to contribute effectively." Walsh listened intently, occasionally nodding as Maria spoke. When the story was finished, she sat quietly for a moment, processing what she had heard. "Ma'am, do you think Sergeant Major Harrison would give me a fair hearing if I came forward about my condition?" Maria considered the question carefully. "I think the Harrison you would meet today is very different from the man I encountered 3 months ago. But you should know that it won't be easy, and you'll need to be prepared for some difficult questions and possibly some skepticism." Over the next several weeks, Maria worked closely with Walsh to prepare for her medical review. They gathered documentation of her job performance, letters of recommendation from supervisors, and medical reports that clearly outlined her current capabilities and limitations. Most importantly, they developed a detailed plan for how Walsh could continue to serve effectively with appropriate accommodations. The day of Walsh's meeting with Harrison, Maria waited anxiously in her office. She had offered to attend the meeting as an advocate, but Walsh had decided she needed to face this challenge on her own, just as Maria had done. 2 hours later, Walsh appeared in Maria's doorway with tears streaming down her face. For a moment, Maria feared the worst, but then she saw that Walsh was smiling through her tears. "He approved my request to stay on active duty," Walsh said, her voice shaking with emotion. He asked tough questions, but they were fair questions. And when I explained how I could adapt to my limitations, he listened. He actually listened. Maria felt a deep sense of satisfaction and pride, not just because Walsh had succeeded, but because it represented something larger. A fundamental shift in how the military was beginning to view and treat its wounded and disabled members. The success stories began to multiply. A soldier with PTSD who had been afraid to seek treatment was able to get help while remaining on duty. A sergeant who had lost hearing in one ear during a training accident was reassigned to a role that utilized his technical expertise. Each case built on the precedent that Maria's confrontation with Harrison had established. 6 months after that initial meeting, Maria found herself in Conference Room B again, but this time the circumstances were completely different. She had been asked to serve on a committee developing new Army-wide policies for evaluating and accommodating service members with disabilities and injuries. Harrison was also on the committee, and as they worked together, Maria saw a man who had been genuinely transformed by their earlier encounter. He approached every case with empathy and fairness, always looking for ways to help soldiers continue serving, rather than reasons to discharge them. During one of their committee meetings, Harrison asked to speak with Maria privately after the session ended. They remained in the conference room as the other members filed out, and Maria found herself sitting across from him at the same table where their confrontation had taken place. "Maria," he said, using her first name for the first time since they had known each other, "I've been wanting to have this conversation for months, but I wasn't sure how to approach it." Maria waited, curious about what he wanted to say. "What you did that day, showing me your scars, confronting my prejudices, it changed me fundamentally, as a leader and as a person. I've been in the Army for 26 years now, and I thought I knew everything there was to know about evaluating soldiers and making personnel decisions. But you taught me that I had become rigid and closed-minded, and that my attitudes were causing real harm to good soldiers." Maria could see the sincerity in his expression and hear it in his voice. "Sergeant Major, I appreciate you saying that, but I hope you understand that what I did that day wasn't something I wanted to do. It was a last resort. A desperate attempt to defend my honor and my right to serve." "I know that," Harrison said quietly. "And that's what makes it even more powerful. You were willing to expose your most vulnerable self to fight for what you believed in. That took incredible courage, and it opened my eyes to how wrong I had been." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "I want you to know that every policy we've changed, every accommodation we've made, every soldier we've helped stay on duty, it all stems from that moment when you refused to let me dismiss your sacrifice." Maria felt a complex mix of emotions. The memory of that day was still painful for her, but knowing that something positive and lasting had come from her suffering made it feel worthwhile. "What I've learned," she said, "is that sometimes the most important battles aren't fought on foreign battlefields. Sometimes they're fought right here, in conference rooms and offices, against ignorance and prejudice and systemic unfairness." Harrison nodded. "And sometimes it takes someone with the courage to bear their scars, literally and figuratively, to wake the rest of us up to what we're doing wrong." As they continued to talk, Maria realized that her story had become something larger than just her own personal struggle. It had become a catalyst for change, a reminder that every person deserves to be judged on their merits rather than their limitations. Walking out of that conference room for what might be the last time, Maria reflected on how much her life had changed since that difficult day when she had been forced to reveal her battle scars. She had not only secured her own future in the Army, but she had helped create a more inclusive and fair system for all soldiers who faced similar challenges. The scars on her leg would always be there, a permanent reminder of the price of service. But they had also become something else, a symbol of resilience, courage, and the power of standing up for what's right, even when it requires exposing your deepest vulnerabilities. Maria had learned that sometimes the most profound victories come not from hiding our wounds, but from having the courage to reveal them when the truth needs to be told. Her battle scars had become her greatest strength, and in showing them to one skeptical sergeant major, she had changed not just her own life, but the lives of countless other soldiers who would benefit from the more compassionate and fair system she had helped to create.